So
he's really getting into his Bible and getting faithful, very faithful now. So
we should hook them up for a date.
Yeah,
I
right.
don't know, how old is she?
29.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh,
yay.
you never know.
No, seriously. I know she's looking for a faithful guy.
Okay.
It's very, very important to her. So, yeah. And so was Amy, her roommate, the violinist who played with us a couple times. But she's up in New York now, so that's can't set them up for a date.
No.
She's back in grad school for violin. So.
Who was the flutist? Who was the flutist on Sunday?
Catherine DeBozer, she and her husband Carl are new members of the congregation.
Okay.
Carl is actually he's done music at other churches and he's a composer. He just finished a musical about a year ago. I helped him do the read-through, one of the online read-throughs they did for it. I forget what character I played, but it flips back and forth between a modern Lutheran parish where they're dealing with a drug problem with a kid and his family, to Martin Luther and what he was dealing with. And Martin Luther sort of becomes the inspiration for the pastor in the modern situation. So yeah, they're both very accomplished musicians. Yeah, it was neat.
Are they members now?
Yes, they are. Mm-hmm. So we got through a whole 2 verses of Genesis. We were booking last
We were
week.
really-
Wow, I was reading and everything. Probably like chapters ahead.
Yeah, this Bible study's kind of the opposite of Michael's. Michael can get through a Bible in a year, and we took 3 years to get through Luke, I think. So we go really slow. So that the good news is that, like, you go away on vacation, you come back, and you've only missed half a paragraph, So.
We're thorough.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, and we call it Bible study, but we go down all these rabbit trails as we get into it, because you've been here listening to us online, so you know what it's like. So, the one thing I don't know if we talked about last week as we get ready to jump into verse 3, is this language in verse 1 of God created the heavens and the earth. The verb used in Hebrew is unique. It's not making. God will make things later in Scripture, and lots of other people will make things too. This verb here is created, and the phrase is ex nihilo is the phrase that's gotten associated with it, which literally is just for it's Latin for out of nothing.
Okay.
So it's unique in the Hebrew Scriptures. God using this. So God is this in verse 1 is creating stuff out of nothing at all. And remember, I'm going to make the case as we go along here that this creation story is a particular form of temple building account. They're using a form, just like the Gospel of Luke used Roman biography as the form to tell the story of Jesus. That's what Luke chose as his vehicle. They're using the ancient Hebrew writer of this is using a form that the ancient world would have been familiar with. Their neighbors in these other religions and these neighbors in these other ethnic groups would have been familiar with this form. But in their stories, when the God helps them build a temple, he's building with stuff that already exists. Even in the creation stories of the other accounts, like Tiamat vomits up the world. She's the god of chaos, in the Babylonian stories. Or the Akkadian stories. So you get these kind of different ways of doing things, but it always starts with something. Remember, most of the ancient Greeks believed matter was eternal, right? And in fact, modern science believed that until Big Bang Theory came along. Once they discovered background radiation and all this other kind of stuff, they had to account for this, and then they discovered what's called redshift. So, you know how the spectrum of light works, right? And most of us remember Roy G. Biv to get your rainbow. So it goes from infrared to ultraviolet, and you got on the extremes on either end, like microwaves. I think down at the low end, and gamma rays are up at the high end, beyond purple. So what they discovered was that most stars have what they call redshift, so that we can see the light from them, but the light has been shifted in the direction of red, which means it's moving. The star is moving away from us so fast that light is getting stretched out. Just like when you hear a siren go by on an ambulance, like that, right? It sounds like the pitch is changing, but it's not. It's just that at first it's coming towards you, and it sounds like the pitch is going up, and then it moves away from you. The waves are stretching out. So once they discovered this, they had to come up with a theory to account for all of it, and they came up with the Big Bang theory. What was interesting was that it was mostly opposed by scientists who were afraid that it would validate the Bible. That's what's crazy. We forget that now, but in the early 20th century, all these scientists were like, we can't say this is science. It's going to sound like the Bible. It sounds like created out of nothing. It's exactly what it sounds like. And that was why there were so many opposing it. I forget who the two physicists were. There's a famous story of them walking the streets of Austria late at night going, did we just prove the Bible right? Oh my gosh, we might have just proved the Bible right. You know? Because, of course, the story had been since the Enlightenment, it was science versus the Bible. Now, it was never the Christian story, but it was the Enlightenment's story. So this creating out of nothing is unique. So this is already setting God apart from the gods of the other temple accounts. Even though they're using a form of storytelling that these other cultures would be familiar with, in all those other stories, they also account for the beginning of the God, right? Most of us, it doesn't matter which of your mythologies you go with. In the Norse mythologies, you have the giants, right, who precede the Norse gods, and eventually Ragnarok is when they have to fight them again, right? You have the, I don't know, I'm actually pretty terrible at I should know my Eastern, what do you call it, Middle Eastern ancient ones better. But like, for instance, Zeus kills his father Kronos to take his place, right? So the beginning stories of the other religions all account for how the gods got there too. This starts with the assumption that God is. There's no account here of how God comes to exist. And that's really different from all the other stories like it all around the world, okay? And all around the world that was in their ancient world. They're the only ones that their creation story starts by assuming God exists. And in fact, that becomes one of the definitions of God. He is the uncreated one, right? So one of the reasons why so many debates on YouTube are boring is because when you get an atheist versus a Christian, the atheist wants to, or scientist versus a Christian, they want to say, well, how did God get created? Well, that's the definition of God. There's no creation of God. We don't need to account for him. What we need to account for is all of this. Because we can't just assume this exists, because the Big Bang tells us that at one point it didn't. Okay? It's not God who needs an account for his existence, it's us. So this is what we have in this opening verse. This created the heavens and the earth. And then, of course, this without form and void. And that language, without form and void, only occurs 2 other times in Scripture. Both times it occurs in the prophets, and both times it's a word of judgment. So what it's basically, when it comes as a word of judgment, God is basically saying, I will return you to what was before. So in this case, in verse 2, without form and void does not mean God's judging the world. It's what the world looks like without God's blessing. Okay? Without God's blessing, you have chaos. Mm-hmm. And that's what the waters symbolize. And now we'll move on to verse 3. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. All right. So before we go on to day 2, what grabs you?
It's hard to comprehend. To us, light is the sun, and dark is nothing, not the sun.
Right.
And the sun isn't created yet.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're right. Sun comes later. Yep. What else?
Well, it's God's word
Okay.
that
Is the acting
Yeah,
agent.
right.
Yeah, it's God's creating with words.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It does say that the light is good.
Yes.
It doesn't say that the darkness is good.
Ah, that's really significant.
Mm-hmm.
That's really significant. Yeah, and it's, later on, of course, we're going to have things like especially John. The Apostle John picks up this imagery so well, which is interesting because he wasn't the rabbi of the group, right? Paul was. But here's this relatively uneducated fisherman who, when you get to 1 John, he's going to say, God is light and in him there is no darkness at all. That the light is blessed, but the darkness is not, right? And of course, at the beginning of John's gospel, you have this, you have this imagery of light coming back. And in fact, John's gospel gets dominated by the narrative of there's the children of light and the children of darkness. So this light and dark, right from verse 3 of Genesis, is going to become critical to the way John tells the story of Jesus.
If you get to Revelation, they talk just about light. There is only light. There is no darkness.
That's right. There is no light or day, no day or night in the new creation, right? In the fulfilled new creation. Absolutely.
Is there anything to this where God calls one day and calls one night?
Yes.
And it's Adam who names, he allows him to name things.
Excellent. Yeah, we're gonna see Adam and Eve created in the image of God as we get to the end of the first chapter of Genesis. And then we're going to see Adam commissioned to name things in Genesis 2. So you're seeing him acting in the stead of God. And that's going to be important for us to understand what it means that they're created in God's image and what Adam and Eve's roles are to be vis-a-vis creation. God's creating, but Adam and Eve are going to have a role to play, which is going to be unique, which is why they're made in God's image. No other part of creation has the same role as Adam and Eve. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. What else? Anything else grab you here? I just realized that people online can't see me writing ex nihilo, but that's okay.
Well, it doesn't really say how long the first day is. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I mean, you don't really know.
Right.
I mean, we think of 24 hours, but.
Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, there's whole ministries dedicated to being clear about the fact that these are 6 24-hour days and have to be, or the Word of God is null and void, right? One of the more famous ministries in the world, one of the most well-funded ministries in the world is dedicated to that. Yeah, what's interesting here, and it was Dr. Hugh Ross who first pointed this out to me, the Hebrew word yom, which is the word we translate as day, is actually used 3 different ways. These are really thin pens, wow. Yeah. Can you read them at that distance? It's like really blurry. Yeah, the Hebrew word yom is the word we translate as day, but it can equally be translated epoch or millennia or period of time. It's actually an indeterminate period of time. You have to get from context how long it is. Okay? And that's just the nature of the Hebrew language. Now, is it traditionally treated as a day? Sure, absolutely. And symbolically, it's a day, but we don't know how long it actually means. And it's not trying to square modern science with the Bible to say that, because Peter says it in his letter. He said a day to God is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. It's both. Time just doesn't work for God like it works for us, and God's the only one on the scene right now. It's only when we get in the picture that time has to operate differently, right? So this word can mean anything you want. And I'm going to pull in a couple, as we go, I certainly have my way of understanding these texts, but I don't want to pretend they're exhaustive. I'm going to pull in what I know from other ways of thinking about it. So certainly through a good part of Jewish and Christian history, these were viewed as 6 literal 24-hour days, and there's nothing, I want to say, wrong with that when your belief in the nature of the universe is so short. Now, even in the early church, there was debate and discussion about that. So Augustine believed this all happened on one day, or if you want to say it in one instant, because that's the way creation works. If you're creating out of nothing, it's all happening instantaneously. You don't need time to do it, right? So he definitely saw the days as symbolic, as having a meaning. And of course, the symbolism gets expressed in what? We're required to keep a Sabbath day, right? Now, that's not the only way to interpret it. So you heard me mention Dr. Hugh Ross. He's a cosmologist the work of his life has been to talk about creation and science, and meaning creation being the theology, a biblical theology of creation and how it works with modern science. He actually got converted to Christianity by reading Genesis. He compared it to all those other ancient narratives, and he looked at it and went, this is the only one that lines up with what we know from the fossil record. All the other ones don't work. But he did realize that when he was learning his language, that the word yom in Hebrew, because he decided to get serious about this, he was going to read this in the original language. So he read it once he saw the pattern, and that this word in Hebrew didn't mean necessarily one 24-hour day. It could mean a period of time of any sort. So then he started digging into it. So he would interpret this first day as the let there be light. I'll back you up to his way of looking at this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that's everything, right? That's the Big Bang from a scientific perspective. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So in his reading, this is God hovering over the primordial sea. Okay? So where your location changes. One is God above everything, right? God outside of the universe. He's creating everything that exists, all the way out to the farthest reaches. And then your next sentence, your setting changes. Your setting is the primordial earth, and God's on earth. Well, again, the reconstruction of science about that period of history would be, there was such a thick cloud cover, no light got through. So God creates light first, meaning the cloud cover thins enough that light can show through, but not a sun. Okay?
Light of God.
And that is, I think, the more significant thing, is that the one who is light and in whom there is no darkness at all is bringing his own presence, in a sense, into this chaos, is the first thing he's doing. But that's how Dr. Ross reads it, is that the primordial cloud cover got thin enough that you could have light showing through. But I think you caught the most important thing, Terry, that the dark is not blessed. The light is blessed.
Well, you had said that earlier, that it was dark until he blessed it.
Right. Exactly. And that's the formless and void piece. So the first bit, and what we see here is God bringing order out of chaos. So the first thing he does is introduce light into the formula. And I say formula because this is what you see going on here. There's a formula that's going to be to each of the 6 days. So what's the formula as you guys read it? First, God does what?
Light. No creation.
How does he do it? Megan caught us. Huh?
Word.
Yeah. So God speaks. So this is the pattern that you're going to see in the days. This is the way the creation works. Okay. I was just teaching this to the younger kids in the first thing. The Bible uses patterns to tell the story and to let you know how to expect things and to make you pay attention. When you see, we've talked about this in Luke and less in Acts. When the Bible repeats itself, pay attention, right? That's trying to draw your attention to something. So the first thing is God speaks. And what does he? And then?
It happens.
Then it happens, right? God speaks. Whatever God speaks happens. And that becomes very important for Lutheran theology because we call that the performative word of God. As God says it, it happens. It's not God says it and maybe it happens. Okay? What's next? God does what?
Light.
Mm-hmm. And then God sees the light, right? He sees that it's good,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
This is going to be the pattern you're going to see in all these days. God sees that what he did, God sees that what God did was good. Sees it good. And then what?
the theory.
And then God separates. Okay? So you'll see this pattern happen in every day of creation. Okay? So the thing that God creates separates it from the thing that it's not. So God is making distinctions. This was formative for me when I started reading Genesis seriously after hearing Dr. Ross's presentation back in 1995 when he came to the University of Michigan, because my own journey to faith began in freshman English class when I entered as an atheist. Most people go to college to lose their faith. I went there to find mine. I went there and we read a book about the difference between this and that. It was a philosophy book. It was very famous in the 70s. It was a very popular book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It was very popular back then. As we read that book, the thing that the author of the book comes to is that there's distinctions between this and that and this and that and this and that. And the way he built the argument, I went, I think he just proved there's a God. God's the one who makes the distinctions between this and that. And that's, as I started reading the Bible and reading Genesis rather, and God's separating this and that. And that seems to be what God does. He's taking this primordial chaos, which if you think about what chaos is, it's just a mass, right? It's just mess. And now you can identify this and this, which are different things. And we can identify this and this. And that's what God's going to do. And then there's this refrain, I'm going to call it, that at the end of this pattern, the refrain is, of course, there was morning and there was evening, right? Sorry, is that what it is? It was an evening, there was morning.
Evening and then there was morning.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah.
And morning,
There was evening and morning.
second day.
Right. Okay. And that gives you the end. So this is literally like a refrain. So this is a clue to you that this is poetry. This isn't just prose, right? This is epic poetry. So it's not, it's not kind of cutesy poetry you get inside a Hallmark card, but it's more like Virgil. It's more like Ovid. It's more, they're telling it in a poetic form, and the refrain helps you remember the rhythm of this stuff, right? So that's going to be our pattern as we go on. Anything else about the first day? All right, verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. So, again, what grabs you? Do you understand the imagery going on here? The waters above and the waters below is the oceans or the below waters, and the heavens are the waters above, right? So it's not heaven as in outer space, right?
I would think of it as clouds and rain, and there's water up there.
Yeah, exactly. And
And the water below,
precisely.
bubbling
Yeah,
springs
precisely.
coming up from the ground.
That's
or
why it would
whatever.
be imaged that way for ancient people. Because remember, one of the things I try to teach the kids when they're reading the Bible was written for you, but it was not written to you. Okay? So God is not going to use a modern way of speaking because we're used to it, because then it wouldn't mean anything to the original people. Okay? It has to mean something to all of us throughout history. So God has to speak in a way that speaks to the people of the era in which it was written, okay? And like I said in the first day we started talking about this, by the time these are written down, these stories are in people's memories already because they've been passed down verbally for generations, okay? So this is going to be, this is, for lack of a better word, an ancient worldview in terms of what's up there. Well, the ocean's blue and the sky is blue, so that must mean if this is water, that must be water too. It's just way up there. And that's the expanse between them. In the old King James, I think they called that the firmament. Right? That becomes the space between them. But what's interesting, again, here, Dr. Ross, I'm going to bring in, if I remember correctly, his lecture from 28 years ago, where he talked about this. You have this, the waters from the waters. Of course, what he's seeing that if you're on the primordial earth, and basically the primordial earth was, you had this cloud cover, right? Just like Venus, and it's raining, and it's so hot when the water hits the ground, that's world, right? Until it finally cools down enough that the water can start to lay in puddles and pool. And then what you start to get is, instead of having just this constant foggy, rainy mess, you got a space between them. And here's the ocean, and here's the waters above, and here's the waters below. So it could still speak, just as it's written, to a modern scientific mindset, but it could equally speak to those ancient people who thought that the sky was made out of water. Okay? Does that make sense? So the language, and to me, I see that as a form of providence, where God is crafting these words so they can speak to people who won't be born. I don't know how many generations is 3,700 years, or longer than that. This is probably written about 3,700 years. Yeah, probably written, maybe 3,200 is written around the time of Exodus, is when it's actually written down. So, yeah, so that God could make these words speak equally across all those different years is highly unusual, and to me shows some of the divine inspiration here. What else grabs you about this? So you see the formula, right? Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. The expanse separated the waters, and it was so. He calls the expanse heaven. This is the same word for sky as in Hebrew. And so there's two ways in which that word is used. Heaven is sometimes used as the place where God is, and sometimes it's used as a place where the birds are. Okay? And even in ancient Hebrew thinking, that was not the same place. The heaven that God lived in was not just above us, although symbolically it's above us. And a really great discussion in a podcast I listened to about why you would use the symbolism of above. Why do all cultures use above as meaning something superior, as opposed to below as something superior? Why don't they ever invert that? And the guy had a great image. He said, imagine you're in a room full of people, like you're just in this massive hundreds and hundreds of people, and everyone's the same height. The person who can get on a chair and do this has a different point of view, right? That's why you use above as the image for superior. But yeah, the ancient Hebrews did not think of God as living in the sky with the birds, okay? But they did think of God as above them, morally as well as, in a certain sense, physically.
Now, what is firmament?
This would be the word, in my translation, it's expanse. That's the difference, the separation between them. I think the old King James uses firmament, is that language. It's what separates deep heaven, for lack of a better word, from the waters below, right? And this is giving space for the birds to operate and things like that. And of course, it's going to harken back to verse 1, right? God created the heavens and the earth. So you could sort of translate that as the sky and the land as well, if you wanted to. There's different ways you could look at that language. And of course, here you get I didn't mention this before, in the refrain, you get the Hebrew reckoning of time, evening and morning. This is why we count 3 days for Jesus, right? He rises on the third day, not on the second day, because Romans counted time from sunrise to sunrise. We count time midnight to midnight. They counted time sunset to sunset. Okay? Evening and morning makes a day, not morning and evening. Okay. Anything else for that, for day 2? All right, day 3. Verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Okay. So what grabs you here? Anything? Well, this is the first time we get a duplet, right? There's two, and God saw that it was good.
Mhm.
First, you get the separation of the land and the sea. Then you get the vegetation, all right?
Well, we might say species or whatever word we use, but he
Mhm.
uses, it's kinds here, which would kind of include, I would assume, everything.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. But this is all vegetation, though, at this point.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's no animals yet at this stage of the game.
Everything-
Everything can, oh,
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, you go ahead.
And all the vegetation can reproduce.
Mhm.
And yeah, how often is the word seed repeated?
Yeah.
I was just gonna say too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and then I'm sorry to go a different place, but
It's all good.
And how he used the mustard seed, going to, how the faith of
Uh-huh.
mustard seed, how
Uh-huh.
everything, and now seeds are mentioned here too. I'm just.
Yes.
how
Well,
it
and
all
seeds
just
are
kinda
about
pulls
fruit.
together.
Yeah, it's about fruitfulness, right? It's about the fact that now what you're starting to get is life, right? To the point where in the Old Testament, seminal fluid is referred to as a man's seed. Okay, it's how creation will, or what we would call we call it procreation, right? That's what separates procreation from creation. Creation is ex nihilo. Procreation is what happens within the creation that God has made. So yeah, this focus on seed means that the world is beginning to be filled, that there's life now, right? Up till now, we've had no life.
Mhm.
So here's where we're going to start to, now I'm going to help you get us into the days a little bit here. So with these days, we had this language in the beginning of verse 2. The earth was formless and void, right? So formless is obvious, right? Chaos, nothing. Void means what?
Nothing.
Empty.
Like nothing.
It's empty, yeah. So what you have is days 1, 2, and 3, God's going to get rid of the formlessness. He's going to give it form. Days 4, 5, and 6, he's going to fill it so that it's the opposite of void. Okay? So what we have here is what does God fill the chaos with on day 1?
Light.
Light, yeah, right, exactly. So first we're going to get light. And then day 2.
Separate the air, the water from below and above.
Okay. Is that? Oh, sorry. Yep. Yeah. Separating of the waters, so you get sky and sea. Okay. And then, what's day 3?
Vegetation.
Well, the vegetation's
before that,
second.
the earth.
Okay, right. So you're going to get land separated from the sea, and vegetation everywhere. And it's, my late mother-in-law used to say, when people would want to argue that the Genesis passage didn't represent, science and this kind of stuff, she would say, what's amazing is that you had this desert-dwelling people who could figure out that life began in the ocean. Are you kidding me? Doesn't that speak to something going on here deep and spiritual? Yeah, absolutely. So he takes the formlessness away by making light, the sky, and what you might generically call the earth, or the heavens and the earth, and the land and the sea on the earth, and then vegetation, right? So from a standpoint of the Old Testament, the vegetation is part of the backdrop. It's part of the setting, okay? God is setting the stage. Now God's going to fill the stage up, okay? Okay. So, verse 14 for the fourth day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So what is God filling now? What's God going to fill up the light with?
The sun and the moon.
Right, sun, moon, and stars, right? Those are the lesser lights, or the stars, and what we call the planets.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the word planet means wanderer, and so it's things that don't like all the other stars move predictably around the North Star, right? Everything that doesn't follow that track is a planet in ancient way of thinking, okay? Whether we would call it a planet or not, they called it a planet. So you get the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay. Absolutely. Anything else grab you about that day?
Well, it's just a lot of light. When you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what I think. I mean, that's a lot of light that he's putting into that.
Yes. Into the primordial darkness, God is bringing a lot of light.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? A lot of light for the people to function within, who are going to show up on day 6.
Well, God is outside of time. Is he creating time here with the days and the months and the?
From a modern, from our perspective, we would
think of
definitely
that?
see that as happening now. That
Yeah.
with creation comes time, right? Which again is something the Big Bang Theory affirms. There's no time before the Big Bang. So time is a function of creation. So, and the better way to think about it is when we talk about God being eternal, we don't mean he's really old. We mean he's beyond time. So a better way to think of God interacting with it is, with the creation, is there are times when it comes into our consciousness and to our awareness that God is there and God's interacting with his creation. But God is not required ever to do that. The creation doesn't shackle God down. God is outside of it, functioning in whatever way he chooses to and interacting with it in whatever way he chooses to. Yeah.
Wonder what would happen if he would see something wasn't good. He would change it.
Why would there be something?
Right now there's only what he's creating. So yeah.
So that's
The-
always good.
Hold that question for chapter 3. We're going to get to what happens when not good enters the picture here. Yes.
Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh.
so before this,
Mhm.
when he filled the sky,
Mhm.
when we get into, the birds and stuff,
Yes.
insects, what do insects say?
Save that question. We're almost there. That's good. That's the next day. So let's do that, okay? Verse 20. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. So let me answer your question now that we've read it. Again, I'm going to go back to Dr. Ross. He was the first person to draw to my attention that the word in Hebrew here is not specifically bird, although it's often applied to bird. It's flying things,
Okay.
and that covers your bugs. As all of us who live in Pennsylvania and have to deal with mosquitoes know
And they
well.
were all good.
They were all good. Yeah, apparently they weren't bloodsuckers back then. Yeah, there you go. But yes, you have this every winged creature according to its kind would be another way to say it. So you have the living creatures, and notice how the sea creatures are specifically focused on here. So what he's doing now is you have these two is what he's filling next. The land creatures come on day 6. This is the parallel. This is, again, a clue that this is a song or a poem because you have this parallelism. Parallel structure is a lot of how Hebrew structures its poetry. And Jesus does it in his parables, too. Remember, Jesus would have been preaching in Aramaic in all likelihood, which is a cognate language or a related language to Hebrew. So sky and sea, you get the winged creatures or the flying creatures. And the water. So the things he created in day 2, he's filling up on day 5. They have the form, now they will no longer be void. We're going to come back to all these in a minute. Once we get to the end of day 6, we're going to go through these again. But yeah, the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves. And again, fascinating that this ancient desert-dwelling race would see the oceans being filled first. You know, again, speaking to the more than human origin of this story. Anything else about day 5? Like I said, we're not going to exhaust all the meaning in these stories, or we could be here on chapter 1 for 30 weeks. We're gonna keep moving along, and this is meditation literature. We're supposed to come back to it again and again, so we're gonna get some good meaning out of it the first time, then we can come back to it again later, and it will get referenced over and over again throughout the Old Testament. So Genesis, the foundations we're getting in Genesis are just that, they're foundations for our later reading. Okay. Verse 24, unless you want to go on, do you have something else for day 5?
As with the vegetation, be fruitful.
Be
You
fruitful.
know, with it.
Yeah, and with the seed, that's obvious. Again, to anybody who's, remember this is an agrarian society. Everybody knows you put a seed in the ground, it grows. Well, now the animals have to interact a little bit more than just fall into the earth. A dead animal falls into the earth, you don't get a new animal. There's got to be more going on there, yeah, absolutely. Okay, verse 24. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the air according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So let's pause before we go into verse 26. So obviously what we see here, the sea got filled up in the last one, so now we're getting the land filled up, right? You get the land creatures. And of course the purpose of the land creatures is that, the distinction they make is between the general land creatures and those that are used for eating. Right. That is referencing already something that hasn't happened yet, but you're getting the distinction there is the significance to humans. The humans are going to be created as this day goes on, but in the telling of the story, what's significant are these are the animals we can eat and sacrifice. That becomes very important, which animals you can sacrifice and which ones you cannot. Okay, so those are the general creatures, and there's the creatures that are there later on for our sustenance, although Adam and Eve are created vegetarians. Anything else in that first part of day 6?
Well, at this point, you haven't had the fall.
Right.
So would all of these animals, maybe mosquitoes didn't bite Then I don't, I mean,
I
we're
have
all
a-
of these things.
I have a whole book about that.
Oops.
No, it's a good. It is. It's called The End of Christianity. And it's not. It's written by a very confirmed Christian, but basically talking about how do we understand the way the fall works. And to me, this was. It's kind of funny. He reasons his way out. He's a scientist. His name's William Debsky. He's actually one of the progenitors of the intelligent design movement. He was one of the first people to come up with that idea. He was teaching down the road here at Lehigh at the time he came up with it. But he has trouble holding a position in any institution because he's too liberal for the conservative schools and too conservative for the liberal schools, which probably means he's thinking pretty well if he's outside the box enough that he can't make anyone in administration happy with him. He actually came to the conclusion that a lot of the early church fathers came to through a completely different methodology, which is that the same way the cross works backward and forward in time, so the Old Testament saints are just that. The cross works for their salvation, so the fall works both ways in time. So basically, it's not like there's no animal death before this. The important thing is the important thing is that death gets introduced into the world through human sin, and specifically that it affects the humans. Right? That's the story that Genesis is telling, not about animal death. So. But the power of death is present in the world because of our sin, even though it might have been affecting animals before humans came along. I'm telling you his conclusion. I'm not saying you have to come to that conclusion. It's a 350-page book. I'll be happy to lend it to you. Yes. But you're not the first person to ask the question, which is the good news, right? Now, before we go on to verse 26, here's what I want you guys to notice about what's happened here. So God creates form where there was formlessness, right? Now again, the pagan, remember, the author of Genesis is using a temple building narrative that everyone in that region would have been familiar with. Everyone would have known these stories. There's a temple building story for every temple you run into, okay? So how did we get our temple? Everyone knows the way these stories are structured, just the same way everyone knows that in our culture, that if you begin a story with once upon a time, you're about to tell a fairy tale, okay? So they would know the structure here, they'd recognize it, but instead of there being this existing stuff that gets rearranged, God's creating and separating and bringing order, instead of it being the result of chaos, which is how most creation stories work, right? So Tiamat and Marduk fight, and you end up with the world, and that's the mess we live in. We live in the chaos created by the gods. The Jewish account is exactly the opposite. It's that God brings order into the chaos. Okay? So again, what I want you to think about is as they're telling the story, it's not that the story isn't true, it's that they are purposely writing in response to the world around them. They've got neighbors who don't believe this. Just the same way that I preach sermons, I would preach a completely different set of sermons on the same text if this was 1950 and not 2022, right? Because there's different stuff going on in the world. They're telling their story in response to the world that they live in, and in many ways, this account of Genesis 1 is a finger in the eye of all the other creation stories surrounding them. Okay, when we get into the Noah's Ark story, we're going to talk about the Enuma Elish, which is the cycle of the Gilgamesh stories come from, which you probably read in high school literature or something like that. That's their creation story will be in there, but you're going to see, because there's a flood story, the account that the Jews tell is the opposite story, which is interesting because, of course, well, the Jewish account will eventually be that what you hear St. Paul say much later, which is that all the gods of the nations are demons. So when you're at war between God and the demons tell a different story than God does. They always make themselves the heroes, right? and God's the tyrant who won't let them have their way. That's the way so we're going to look at, like, for instance, succession stories are going to be really important. How did the king become king? Well, in almost all the ancient stories, the king becomes king by killing the father. What's the Christian story is that the king becomes king by obeying his father. Right? Going to be very, very critical. So it's interesting that all these ancient stories that surrounded the Jewish one were almost the exact opposite. Everything was inverted. Okay? So, what's especially fun about this, though, is that do all these creatures, do all these things look familiar? Sun, moon, stars, winged things, water animals, land creatures. Does it look like anything? Like every idol in every temple? In every other nation? Right? Eventually, a long way from now, when you get to Exodus, God's going to forbid them to make any graven image. Why? Because God's not one of these things. So all these things that the nations around them worship as gods, God's using to decorate. Yeah. He's not Phoebus Apollo, god of the sun. It's like, oh no, I need a decoration right there. You know? God's in the Marduk stories, is it Marduk? Yeah, it is Marduk. Marduk conquers the sea creature, Leviathan, to gain his throne. God's playing with Leviathan. In fact, creating him and messing around with him. In the Psalms, God's playing with me. Like God sports with Leviathan like the way you play with a puppy. It takes everything Marduk has to conquer the sea creature that God can play with like a puppy. Okay? So all the things that the nations around them worship as gods, God's busy creating in their story. And he's decorating his temple with them. God's temple is creation. And that's why you don't need a specific place to worship God and all that other kind of stuff, right? At least this early on. The temple comes way later, okay? That's not going to be till Solomon that we get a temple, okay? So you have all this stuff going on. So remember, God just calls them out. And what is God's call to Pharaoh? Not just let my people go. It's let them go so they can worship me in the wilderness. In the wilderness where God gets worshipped. God's building his temple as we go. Now, before we jump into the last part of day 6, the last stage of things, it's 12 o'clock. We're going to do this anyway. Okay. The last part of a temple narrative is the creating of the idol for the temple. And the creation of the idol for the temple is how, in a sense, you trap the god there. The gods helped you build the temple. Now, how do you know you'll always have access to the temple? Now, they knew that when they worshiped, for instance, when the Egyptians went to worship Ra, the god of the sun, they knew that the sun did not disappear from the sky when they did that. Okay, so the sun god is up there, but in a sense, he's also here. I know I've got access to him here, and that's the point of the idol. The point of the statue is that you always have access to the god when you need it, because you're there to ask for favors, right? So now, let's read the rest of day 6. Verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And we'll pause there.
This is the first time he uses the word us and our.
Our.
Ah, yeah, that's significant. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sounds like the Trinity.
It does. And Christians have read it that way for hundreds of years. And there's arguments to be made for a couple different ways to read this. It certainly implies the Trinity, right? It certainly implies that God can step outside himself and speak to himself. And so far, because it wouldn't be that the ancient Jews would not have seen God's word yet, and the word here is hypostasis. Christians are not the first ones to use this word. We do use it, though. So the word hypostasis, or hypostasis, was used by not just Jews, but other ancient peoples. The plural of hypostasis is, you put it in either, hypostases. You want to guess where we use this word? Like every Sunday? The Nicene Creed.
I thought it meant,
Oh.
This is the word from the Nicene Creed. When we talk about the different persons of God, that's the word we're translating. So this was already being used by Second Temple Judaism because they kind of noticed, not kind of, they talked a lot about it actually. Most of the reflections of Second Temple Judaism, which is, from about 400 BC to 100 AD, or to 70 AD when the temple gets destroyed. That Second Temple period, all they're thinking about is Daniel. What they notice in Daniel is that Daniel has this vision, and there's God, but then there's God looking like a man, and they seem to be talking to each other. So how does that work? So they're talking about the different hypostases of God, the different powers or authorities of God, different faces of God, different people of God. So Christians aren't the first to use this. We just limit it to three. We're like, oh, there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But Judaism was already talking about this before we came along. This was not the introduction of Greek philosophy to Christianity, which is the way some people have written about it from about the mid-1800s on. Okay? This was Judaism, just kept reflecting based on what happened with Jesus. Okay? So we have this hypostasis idea here. Us. God can talk to himself. In a sense, God can step outside himself and talk to himself in a way, right? At least.
Nothing to do. My wife does it all the time.
I thought, well, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll spill something and go, oh, Jenkins, what are you doing to yourself? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the other way you could interpret this is there's another set of us that God could be speaking to. So this is one way to talk about it, is hypostasis, is God's talking to himself. The hypostasis idea. Who else could God be talking to? They're not mentioned precisely yet in the creation story. So this may be anomalous. This is a less likely thing. But you do see God frequently throughout the Old Testament talking to his divine council. The divine council, this is like a king's council, right? Like the Knights of the Round Table for Arthur. And that's the angels. Divine council, this is a hotly discussed and debated topic right now, but it makes a lot of sense, especially places in the Psalms where like, God, you are great among many gods. Okay, are there other gods? Well, Hebrews never believed that. So it can't mean that. Well, it means that, and we're going to get into Son of God language as we get into Genesis a lot, but it could be he's speaking to his divine council. Let us make. So he might be giving them a role in the making. Or maybe just saying, hey, watch me do this, guys, right?
No, he wouldn't do that.
So we're made in the image of God, and see, this is hard for me right now because, maybe you all don't know it, and maybe this is not the right time for today, but I'm a nurse, and the area that I was working in prior to prior to retirement was the surgery area. And so, people were changing their image. People are changing the way they look, and it's not the way that God created them.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
I don't know. It's tough. It's tough.
It is tough. And this is why, for Christians who want to confess the scriptures, the transgender issue in particular is a break issue. We're going to see this more when we get into the Genesis 2 account. Okay? But here, the significance of God making us in his image is, again, in a traditional pagan account of the temple building, the last thing you do is build the image of the God. The humans make the image of the God in the temple so they can always get to the God. In this account, God places his own image in his temple.